Our text this evening is 1 Chronicles chapter 12, verse 32. Now, by this time, some of you might already have it memorized, but let's read this again. And of the children of Issachar, which were men that had understanding of the times, to know what Israel ought to do, the heads of them were 200, and all their brethren were at their commandment. Now, in this series of lessons that I've been bringing on worldview conflict, we're learning how to understand our times, as did the children of Issachar understand their times. It's important to understand our times. Why would that be? Well, because if we're ignorant of our times, then we're not going to make good choices for ourselves, for our families, for our communities. So it's important to have understanding. And something that I say and have said quite frequently over the years, good decisions are only as good as the information you have. And it's essential that we have an understanding of our times. And that comes from God and from understanding what's going on and having a sense from the Spirit of God giving us wisdom. We live in times of conflict. There's a collision of two primary cultures taking place at this time, mixed with an abundance of other cultural clashes as well. But with all the different cultures that exist, you can boil down the worldview conflicts to two. And that is God's and man's. Now, someone would say, well, that's Satan. Yeah, well, he's on the same side as man too, or man's on the same side as Satan. They're all in the same camp. It's basically God's way and everyone else's way. That's what it comes down to. So really, when we talk about worldview conflict, it's really just that simple. And it reminds me of recognizing falsehoods or even counterfeit money in a bank. You don't get trained to recognize all the counterfeits that are in the world. You simply get trained to recognize the truth. Get trained to recognize what real money looks like. And then anything that doesn't look real must be false. And that's exactly the simplicity of understanding the worldview conflict, is simply know the truth. And then it doesn't matter what falsehood is presented. We recognize it as being false because it's not right. Now, I intend to show the evidence of worldview conflict in our culture, the cause of worldview conflict, and the solution to worldview conflict over this next several lessons in the worldview. And this series of messages are coming out of what I teach at LTIA, our Leadership Training Institute of America, when we do our worldview studies. In the previous lessons that I've already brought, I presented the biblical concepts of, number one, government being God's creation. That's a big deal to get locked away, because a lot of Christians who think, well, government is evil. Well, it's not. God created it, and anything God creates is not evil. Number two, the corruption of government and all other good things that God has given to us is due to Satan's agenda and human depravity. That's what makes government corrupt. The government itself is not corrupt. And number three, the reason for disagreement and politics is because of Satan's agenda and human depravity. People are fallible. We recognize that. Fallibility plus depravity, man, that's a recipe for destruction, isn't it? Now, though at the forefront of the worldview conflict, there are the political factions, politics is not the problem. Politics is associated with and really defines disagreement and debate in a community about how things ought to be done. Well, this is how I think it ought to be done. No, it ought to be done this way. And so you get into political wranglings. There are church politics. You got politics in school and education. You got politics in government at all different levels of government, from municipalities all the way up to federal government and, global government as well. And we can expect disagreement. It shouldn't surprise us, because people are fallible in their thinking and in their opinions. There's going to be differences. And political conflict is not the cause of the conflict. If politics is not the cause of conflict, what is the cause? Sin, fallibility of humanity. The politics, the disagreements, is a symptom of worldview conflict, that there are different values. There's something driving people to different conclusions. Now, the problem in politics then really can be described as a lack of respect for God. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. If everyone respected God and loved God, there wouldn't be political wranglings going on. We'd all be on the same side, God's side. Without respect for God and for others, there's no integrity in resolving disagreements. And I mean integrity. That is giving respect to people to state their opinions. Fine, you got your opinion. I think you're wrong. You think I'm wrong. That's fine with me. I'm not mad about it. I expect people to disagree with me. Hey, that's life, right? We just live with it. But when there's no respect, then you have these wranglings, and it gets really, it gets mean and nasty. The end goal, as we see in our community now and in government now and our politics, the end goal determines and what is justifying the means. What that means is do whatever you think you can do and get away with in order to force and make sure you win with your goal and agenda. That's agenda-driven politics. It might include lying and cheating and stealing and deceiving and anything else. And in some cases, as we know, you look through history of government, transitions, changes, and the Scriptures talks about murder. Yep. There is no limit to what people will do to make sure that their agenda rules. And this results in agenda-driven politics. In contrast to integrity-driven politics, which is a biblical worldview position. This is where you get that contrast between the end justifies the means or the means justifies the end. It's like two boxers going into a boxing match. One guy is fighting by the rules and the other guy is not. Our culture has come to a great and fierce divide right now. It's very intense due to agenda-driven politics. The journey can be described as taking 7 steps away from a biblically based worldview towards a humanistic worldview. The first step is rejecting God. The second step is people rejecting. As people reject God, fewer people in our culture, or any culture, who refuse to pursue the first and great commandment, that means there's going to be less integrity in our culture and our government. Third, with less integrity, there's going to be a greater effort to censor and control the opponents. Fourth, there will be greater efforts to conceal and corrupt activities. Fifth, there will be less accountability. Sixth, there will be increased centralization of government to make control of the people effective. And number 7, this will trend to more fierceness in politics as the clash becomes more intense. And we're seeing that occur right now. And now we know why in politics it's become so fierce in our culture. As Christians, we're responsible to understand our times. I mean, literally responsible. It's not just something, oh, well, this is interesting. We're responsible. We're obligated to understand our times, not to ignore it. The better we understand our times, the better our decisions will be to serve Christ individually and as a church. A perspective of political pacifism in religious communities has crippled the American culture and many of our Christian communities. And that's largely in part the problem that we're faced with today, because so much of our religious community, Christian community, our churches, especially in the previous century, they went into a pacifist mode. And they withdrew themselves from government. Politics is dirty business, and no decent Christian belongs in that. And so with that mindset, it has really led to a devastating consequence in our American culture. It's had a negative worldwide impact on spreading the gospel. And just as negative, there's been a Catholic approach to marrying church and state together with the goal of Christianizing communities by the sword and by government decree. In other words, you got two extremes. One, you're going to marry the church and the state, and the other, Christians ought not to be involved at all. This is dirty business. And so there's two opposing worldviews right there, and both of those are wrong. Now, if government is not the means of spreading the gospel and spreading Christianity, which we believe that it's not, and yet Christians are responsible to be involved in government, then how can Christians participate in government and politics and still be fulfilling their duty as Christians? This very question is what causes a lot of people to withdraw and get out of, or even preach against Christians being involved in politics and government. Because they fail to understand the role of government. And I think at the very bottom, at the very least, there's a failure to understand that God created government. And whatever God creates is good. And it's not up to us to call what God said is good, to call it evil. Now, it's different if we say, hey, there are evil people in what God created that is good. Now, that's different. God didn't set up the church, though, to run governments. And God didn't set up governments to run churches. So we need to figure out, how do we make this work? God's role for His church is to win souls and to train disciples. That's the role of the church. By this means, evangelism and discipleship take place and the world is reached. If the church is fulfilling its role and discipling its members. Well, how do we know the church is still doing its job today? Well, Matthew chapter 28, 19 and 20, it tells us. It tells us that, and lo, I am with you, what? Even to the end. Hey, that's something to take notice of and to take heart in. There will always be, if not churches, there will always be a church doing what God told them to do, right to the end. The world will never be left without the light of the gospel message and the power of God. Now, most religious people think about government as in a very narrow way. They're locked into that thinking that Christians shouldn't get involved in politics and government, and that in some cases, if you don't have that attitude that Christians ought not to be involved in politics, then the other side, government is the means and the mechanism to promote the gospel and turn everyone Christian. Well, we saw that back in the Middle Ages. That was a major disaster. Christianity does not come by the sword, does not come by government. In fact, we've seen government, we've seen Christianity thrive, and I say thrive, survive, and continue to reach people in spite of governments. Government's role in evangelism is to ensure the freedom for churches to evangelize. Now wait, let's pause and think about that for a minute. Government's role in evangelism is to ensure the freedom for churches to evangelize. Well, how can that be? I thought government wasn't supposed to be involved. That's right. Government's role is to ensure freedom. Now wait, how can that be? Most governments are not that way. Remember premise number 1. Who created government? God. If God created government, then government is good. And what is the purpose that God built into government? It's for the purpose of ensuring freedom to believe in Him. Now, we don't see that because that's the way government has been corrupted by depraved humanity. You got unbelieving leaders in government who become the oppressors of Christianity. Unfortunately, due to being in a world of sin and Satan, that which God has intended for good has been turned to evil, hasn't it? Government has been used as a weapon against church evangelism instead of an aid, and churches have had to evangelize in spite of government oppression. Now, in the U.S., churches have enjoyed liberty to evangelize, free from government interference. Early in American history, churches have actually been helped by government policies. And I'm not going to say that's right, but it's not surprising because of those who were in government. And due to the overall presence of Christians in both the population and government. As the Christian presence in American culture has diminished, civil government policies and laws have changed. They're currently trending towards oppressing those who adhere to the Christian worldview. Did you know the Bible's Tract Society was funded by the American government? They were funding missionary programs to reach the world with the gospel message. That seems so foreign to the whole idea of government today for us. But that's how Christianized the American culture was. And they thought nothing of it. Hey, let's use taxpayer money to fund missionary programs. You won't hear that going on today. Though the church and state were created with two different roles, they can't be separated. Two different roles, but can't be separated. First, God created government, and knowing that He created government and He created the church, we have a common link between the two. God. And God has one purpose that guides both government that He created and church that He created. They both have the same ultimate purpose. He's the common link. God created both the church and government with the expectations that Christians would be involved in both. He didn't create government to be a separate entity apart from the rest of creation and reserved only for the lost to participate in. What God makes, He makes for the righteous. He didn't set up government so the lost could rule. That's contrary to a biblical worldview position. God created government to be good, which requires good people. And people who believe in Him. The biblical worldview is that good government requires righteous leaders. I like the quote by John Adams, the second president of the U.S., who said, "Of the U.S. Constitution and government, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." As our culture becomes less religious, the inevitable outcome will be the loss of freedom for Christians and the loss of the U.S. Constitution as it was intended. Number two, government cannot be separated from Christianity due to its role in social life. Where there are people, there is government. I mean, somebody's got to decide how we're going to live. 2 or more people, you got to have government. Every Christian is called to be engaged in evangelism and discipleship. And every Christian, as a citizen of a community, affects and is affected by their government. You can't separate the two. Unlike most governments in human history, citizens of the U.S. have inherited participation in government. This is referred to as a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And the founders referred to the U.S. as a republic. It's a government ruled by law, not by the majority. I had an interesting conversation just a couple weeks ago with a man who disputed that vehemently. I said, well, I understand what you're saying. That's how we think about democracy, and that's how we think about governments today. But if you read the Federalist Papers and you read what the founders of this country thought about, we were set up to be ruled by law. And this form of government was created to ensure that minority voices could enjoy the same protection as the majority. That doesn't mean minority voices enjoy the same protections, but as we have seen in our government and in our culture, they have the opportunity to correct the wrongs. Try and do that in Russia. Try and do that in China. Why is it possible that minority voices can bring about change in America? It is because of the crafting and intention of our founding fathers. And just as important, it ensures that all people in the community are judged by the same laws, even those who rule in government. Well, even as that's what was intended. We see some real double standards today, don't we? Again, what God has set up to be good is always being corrupted by man. We've lost that practice, even though it's encoded in law. We see a double standard in our courts today more clearly than ever. Enforcement of law is only as good as the people making the laws, and only as good as the people who enforce the laws. And that's the problem we're seeing today. As people in our nation become less religious, they become more lawless. The U.S. government was designed for people who respect law. For this reason, President Adams said of the U.S. Constitution that it was made only for a moral and religious people. The U.S. Constitution, the Republic of the United States, the U.S. government is collapsing under the weight of sin and corruption due to increasing presence of the ungodly in government. Winston Churchill lent great insight into the danger of a human democracy, saying this. And before I read that quote, just take a minute here and think about what would be the best evidence against democracy in a civilization? What do you think it might be? Well, Winston Churchill said this: the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. They don't know anything. They don't know who they're voting for or what they're voting for. They are their own worst enemies. And Churchill was an advocate for democracy and freedom. But he was pointing out the flaw. People vote for themselves, not for God. People vote for Barabbas, not for Christ. They vote for personal gain, not for justice and truth. And unlike a republic, a democracy is ruled by the majority. And this spells doom for everyone except those in control. It's easy to understand the attitude that the church and state government should be separated. We wouldn't want the Catholic Church controlling our government. We wouldn't want the Presbyterians or the Congregationalists or the Mormons or the Muslims controlling government. These churches believe in controlling and forcing people in a community to have allegiance to their doctrines. So then how is government kept separate from the church while at the same time being inseparable from the people? Well, it's understanding roles. The role of government should fulfill the purpose of ensuring freedom for its citizens. Freedom to worship as they please and to conduct their evangelism as they are instructed by God. And we're not afraid of debate, are we? We're not afraid of teaching truth, because truth will prevail. Greater is He who is in me than he that is in the world. If we have truth on our side and the liberty to preach truth, truth will prevail. That's why in Satan's regime, it's always about censorship and rewriting and controlling people so that truth will not have a voice. In other words, government's role in evangelism is to protect the freedom of religious expression and to uphold the virtue of honesty and righteousness. This is the government God created. Now, if that's the case, then what is one of the responsibilities of God's people? To make sure that which God created continues to do what's right. And God's people can't do that if they don't get involved in it. Romans 13, verses 3 and 4 says, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil." We think about that and ponder it, and it says, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil." But wait, that doesn't seem to fit our description in America today. It doesn't fit the description in Russia. It doesn't describe the situation in Iran or Iraq. Most of the countries of the world, the rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. It seems like they're doing a pretty good job supporting and advocating evil rather than good. It says, "Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil." You have to stand back and say, "No, wait, Lord. Evil is being called good today. Good is being called evil. Evil is being promoted and protected, and the good is being destroyed. What does this mean?" Romans 13 is telling us what God intended for government to be. It's telling us this is the way it ought to be. If it's not because God failed. It's because of the people who are in government. They are disobeying God. Now, there's a lot to say about Romans 13, especially the way we ought to view government, even under wicked rulers. The bottom line is everyone answers to God, our highest authority. Even those who are above us and ruling over us, they're going to answer to the higher authority. And if there's conflict between us and the higher authority, we have to go to the highest authority. As the apostles had to ask the question, "Judge ye among yourselves who we ought to obey, man or God." I know where that goes. Because now, God gets blamed for a lot of things, doesn't He? And so that phrase has been used for an excuse for rebellion. But the whole point of Romans 13 is there is no excuse for rebellion. As citizens of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, we're obligated to understand our roles, not to ignore and be ignorant of our roles. Dismissing the biblical theology of government with a flippant statement such as, "Oh, the government is not important to evangelism of the world," That statement contradicts biblical theology in Romans 13. If understanding government and our role in government is not important, then why did God waste His time writing it? Now, we don't want to be on that side telling God, well, you wasted your words and your time writing about things that are unimportant. God never wrote anything that's unimportant. Dismissing the biblical theology of government is not where we want to be. If government were not important, then God would not have created it. He would not have given instruction about it. It's a fallacy to dismiss the importance of the doctrine of government as presented by God in the Bible just because it's not the gospel message. Whatever God has taught in His Word is important. Everything is important. What God says is good and important, let no man say otherwise. Now, here's 6 doctrinal concepts from the Bible to keep in mind when thinking about government. Number 1, government is God's creation. Number 2, government is good. Number 3, government is important. Number 4, government is inseparable from those who live in a community. Number 5, government is corrupted by human depravity. Number 6, government integrity, as God intended, requires the presence of Christian integrity. In the previous lesson, I mentioned that there is a teaching that God chooses the leaders of a nation exclusively. Again, God gets blamed for a lot of bad, evil things in the world. No wonder people look. I remember in my own days, even in college, we were going through studies and lessons of bringing grievances before government. We had that in our history, our literature, and our philosophy classes. And so we studied a lot of the books of utopian writers and how to redress the government when there's grievances. And I mentioned in the previous lesson that God chooses the leaders of nations. There have been a lot of wicked leaders. And I'll guarantee you God had nothing to do with it, though He gets blamed. And as a lost man, in college, I'm thinking, boy, that God is an evil, wicked God. In fact, there is no God. How could there be a God with all this corruption and evil going on in the world? Now, the statement that God chooses leaders of nations, it's not wrong, but it's not accurate. There's a more accurate way to say it. To think biblically about civic leaders in government, we need to consider the whole counsel of God, not just take a few verses that suit our prejudices and our personal opinions. God is involved in the affairs of men. Daniel chapter 9 especially makes that clear. He's involved in governments of men. Romans 9:17 says, "For the Scripture saith unto Pharaoh, even for this purpose have I raised thee up, that I might show my power in thee, and that my name might be declared throughout all the earth." God takes credit for that, for raising up Pharaoh to shut down Israel until all seven judgments of Israel were fulfilled. Well, you know why that had to be, right? There is no liberty, there is no freedom, there is no deliverance from bondage of sin except for the death of the firstborn. God could not allow Israel to be delivered or freed before the death of the firstborn. And He went after every god in Egypt to demonstrate failure, 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 failure. They cannot give anyone freedom. Only through the death of the firstborn is there freedom. God had to shut down Pharaoh's heart, harden his heart. Why? Because as you read through the story, Pharaoh was ready to let Israel go. And it says God hardened his heart. Why? Because the death of the firstborn had not taken place yet. So God is involved. But look at Hosea chapter 8, verses 3 and 4. God says, "Israel hath cast off the thing that is good, The enemy shall pursue him. I want you to underline that word. They have set up kings, but not by me. God's saying, don't blame me for these leaders. Don't blame me for this government over Israel. I didn't put them there. That's not my fault. They set up their own kings. They have made princes, and I knew it not. I did not approve it. I did not condone it. I had nothing to do with this. Don't blame God for wickedness in the world. That's an important principle. And yet God gets blamed with this exclusive doctrine that goes around. God is in charge and puts everyone in power. That is in power and sets up governments. Stop blaming God for evil and wickedness in the world. This verse clearly states that God does not take credit for corrupt leaders or the corrupt leaders chosen to lead Israel. It's a mistake to blame God for choosing everyone who is in government. And I use the word blame to emphasize that God gets accused of a lot of things that he has nothing to do with, and that's even a contrary to his will and purpose. So we can't say God, yes, God does choose some, but to say he chooses all leaders and governments is to contradict Scripture and set up some very awkward situations to explain. Unless God states otherwise, wicked leaders who lead contrary to the ways of God are not in power by virtue of God and by according to God's will. They are in power by the will of humanity, Satan, and evil. Now, how can we know if God chooses the wicked to rule the land? Well, number one, God is in control of all things. And this means that he can alter anything he wants. It doesn't mean he chooses in every case, just like in your life. God's in control of everything in your life, but he lets you choose to sin and suffer the consequences. And he allows that, just like he did in Hosea chapter 8, when he said, they chose their kings, it wasn't me. If you read through the book of Malachi, you'll see the same thing. Basically, God is saying, you get the leaders you deserve. You don't like the way they're leading, and they're leading you down the drain, and you're suffering, and you don't like it? Well, you're not right with me. So why should I change your leaders? The only safety Israel had against bad leaders was to be right with God. Israel chose men according to their will rather than according to God's will. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 7, God said to Samuel, hearken unto the voice of the people in all that they say unto thee, for they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. And Samuel warned the people, but they would not listen. They did their own thing. Like Israel, the U.S. chooses its leaders. And sadly, we are choosing leaders just like Israel chose their leaders, without God's counsel. We're choosing contrary to the will of God. As the majority of our population increases towards ungodliness, more ungodly leaders will be chosen. And this occurs for two reasons. First, leaders come from the population. The greater the number of the ungodly people there are, the greater the chance the leaders will be ungodly. Second, the majority will choose those who are like them, just like the people chose Barabbas over Christ. When the majority becomes ungodly, the leaders will be ungodly. This will always lead to an inevitable government that is totalitarian. Always. It's inevitable. A totalitarian government ruled by wicked people over a wicked population is inevitable due to the need to control the population. Controlling the population is both necessary and the ultimate goal. Control is necessary to suppress opponents. The inevitability of a totalitarian government is due to the lawlessness of the population. An ungodly population is a lawless population. They lack respect of God and respect for other people. They reject the notion of morality. They live for themselves. The culture becomes very selfish, which is appropriately referred to as a dog-eat-dog world. The culture becomes very selfish. The greater the lawlessness in a population, the greater the need becomes to control the population. And this leads to a bigger military and police state. And as one of our founders of the USA, William Penn wrote, those people who will not be governed by God will be ruled by tyrants. To avoid a police state, lost freedoms, and lost opportunities to improve our lives, a population must be mostly moral and Godward. They must share a sense of morality and values that promote self-control, love for others, and responsibility. That kind of morality and values come with loving God, fulfilling the first and great commandment. I'll wrap up with this thought. God gave Israel instructions on who to choose to lead Israel to ensure blessings of personal freedom. The best government is one nation under God, where all citizens are guided by God personally. But Israel rejected God's will. So God gave Israel instructions on how to choose leaders from among themselves. All right, you guys are going to disobey me and do your own thing? Well, I'll show you how to do it second best. Those instructions that God gave to Israel should be heeded today in our culture. Deuteronomy 1:13, and I leave us with this thought. Moses said, "Take you wise men and understanding, and known among your tribes, and I will make them rulers over you." Wise men and understanding, and known among you. This is the criteria our U.S. founders like John Adams used to create the U.S. government, and why he said that this government is wholly inadequate for any other population other than a moral and religious people. The future of our government and our country is the same as seen in all nations older than ours. As more people reject God, lawlessness increases, government will become more totalitarian, and we're doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. The understanding of our times shows us what to expect and what to prepare for. What we prepare for now, today. As Christians, we'll survive by the grace of God because He's greater in us than He who is in the world. We'll survive in spite of the governments that we're under, which rule us. But God forbid we should be guilty of dismissing the opportunities and privileges given to us by God because we didn't choose the leaders who uphold God's way. Amen?
We're glad you joined us for our services here at Mission Boulevard Baptist Church. If this program has helped you and you would like to have more information about trusting Christ as your Lord and Savior, or if you would like to have resources to help you in your spiritual walk and growth, please email us at the address on your screen. We look forward to having you join us again online, but you are always welcome to personally attend any of our services at the Mission Boulevard Baptist Church here in Fayetteville, Arkansas.
Hi, this is Dr. Patrick Briney. I hope and pray this important lesson has improved your life. For more life-changing lessons and to get your free book that I've written for you, visit my website at patrickbriney.com. And please share this valuable lesson with at least 3 of your friends to enrich their lives in our Lord Jesus Christ. I'll upload my next lesson for you soon. God bless.